out of Rome on Thursday, Pope Francis has changed church teaching on the death penalty, saying it is inadmissible in all cases. I'll share the details and discuss the implications with the Papal Posse in moments. This past week, Pope Francis accepted the former Archbishop of Washington, Theodore McCarrick's resignation from the College of Cardinals. In recent weeks, multiple reports have surfaced that McCarrick had allegedly sexually abused or acted inappropriately with seminarians, a teenaged altar server, and assaulted an 11-year-old boy, a predatory relationship that may have lasted for 20 years. The accusations cover 4 decades, yet McCarrick rose through the ranks of the church hierarchy to become one of the most influential prelates in the U.S. and the world. Also this week, Pope Francis accepted the resignation of Australian Archbishop Philip Wilson. Wilson was convicted and sentenced in May for failing to report the repeated abuse of 2 altar boys by a priest during the 1970s. Wilson, who has denied the accusations, had immediately stepped aside from his duties as head of the Archdiocese of Adelaide after the conviction. But for the past 2 months, he ignored the growing calls for his resignation. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull added his voice to the chorus last month, urging Pope Francis himself to fire the Archbishop. Wilson is the highest-ranking Catholic cleric to be criminally convicted for an abuse cover-up. And back in the U.S., the Bishop of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, has released the names of more than 70 clergymen accused of sexual abuse. The cases all span several decades. Bishop Ronald Gaynor made the announcement on Wednesday in an apology and collective mea culpa to the faithful. He's also taking the extraordinary step of removing the names of all accused priests and every former bishop dating back to the 1940s from places of honor throughout the diocese. Here with analysis on all of this and much, much more is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, joins me in studio, and from Manhattan, canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father GERALD MURRAY. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. A lot to get into. The breaking news, as we spoke about earlier, we'll get to the McCarrick scandal in a moment, but overnight, this other bombshell dropped. Pope Francis has authorized a change in church teaching on the death penalty. And he is saying, I'm going to put up the new and the old. Here's an excerpt from the old catechism teaching on the death penalty. And it reads, assuming that the guilty party's identity and responsibility have been fully determined, the traditional teachings of the Church does not exclude recourse to the death penalty. If this is the way to effectively defend human lives against an unjust aggressor. And then at the end it says, the cases in which the execution of the offender is an absolute necessity are very rare, if not practically existent. So the Church was already, and John Paul, sort of tightening the teaching on this and closing it. Here's the new iteration that the Pope approved in May. Recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. Today, however, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of a very serious crime. Consequently, the Church teaches in light of the gospel that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person, and she works with determination for its abolition worldwide. Father Jerry, I want you to talk about this new standard that the Pope seems to be breathing into the teaching about the violation of the person's dignity, the criminal's dignity. Your thought?
Well, Raymond, this is a very troubling action by the Pope because he is directly contradicting the perennial teaching of the Church about the morality of the death penalty, where the new catechism says that it was once considered appropriate. The word appropriate is a euphemism. It was once considered moral, perfectly good, in fact, something that was in accordance with the natural law and with divine revelation. Now, to say, as this new catechism paragraph says, that it violates the dignity of the human person to execute criminals guilty of a serious crime, I have a great difficulty understanding that. We have an ontological dignity as created by God. We have a supernatural dignity as baptized persons. And the dignity of the human being adheres in him. He cannot lose that dignity no matter what other people do to him or even what he does to himself. Mm-hmm. Now, he can lose the exercise of certain rights through his actions, and that's why we have incarceration and punishment. So to say that the Catholic Church violated the dignity of people until now by saying that it was moral for certain criminals to be executed, I have a great problem in accepting that. I do not believe that the teaching of the Church up to this moment is immoral, and I don't think the Pope has the power to change that teaching. His job as Pope is to preserve and uphold the doctrine of the faith, not to rewrite it. So I'm very, very troubled by this.
Mm-hmm. Well, the fact is it's been changed, though, Father Murray. What Catholics are looking at this, there's a lot of anger on social media. What do you advise them?
Well, the thing is, Pope John Paul II wanted to restrict its application, but he never said that it was immoral. He never said that this act violated human dignity. Violating human dignity means violating God's law. It means offending God. So what the Pope is saying, if you execute criminals, you are committing an offense against God and his law, because human dignity comes from God. So what I say to people is that this change that the Pope is now putting into the catechism is not in accord with the previous doctrine, and it should be, in fact, changed back to the old teaching. That's the way I look at it.
Robert Royal, is this an ex cathedra teaching from the chair of Peter?
I think we're going to have some canon lawyers and theologians and others dig into this. But for me, the odd thing about this is, why was it necessary to say this? When John Paul II promulgated the idea that it was practically non-existent, the reasons for capital punishment were practically non-existent, that, I think, is about as far as you can go as a pope in talking about this, because this is the responsibility of secular authorities. That there are places in the world, probably in the Western world, you could say that the cases where this becomes necessary are few, but you can't outlaw them. And it's certainly in many parts of the world.
What about Africa, where you get
Africa,
a small village?
Think of Asia, where to keep somebody in a prison at the expense of the population for his entire life is a serious injustice toward people who are very poor, starving, etc. It's not hard to imagine all sorts of circumstances in which you would be balancing off different things, and this is precisely what secular rulers are elected to do, or chosen to do. I don't understand why this was necessary, and it seems to me that to make this an absolute principle, saying that it's inadmissible. Now, the Pope, as a private person, can say this. As the Pope, when he says this, to answer your question, I think a loyal Catholic wants to pay careful attention to this and give it due consideration. But at the same time, I don't know that this falls within the purview of the Pope, let alone changing previous church teaching, which in itself is already very troubling. It seems to me that this goes beyond his proper authority.
Okay, Father Murray, I'm going to get to you in a moment, but Bob, you raised the question of this really being a first world perspective on the problem, because we have high maximum security prisons, we have wires and cameras and electrified fences. However, even with that, I'm going to point out two things just in the headlines this week. An inmate in Stillwater, Minnesota, he was serving time for a homicide, killed a corrections officer Wednesday afternoon. The first such death of an on-duty Minnesota prison guard. It does happen. And for the sake of the prisoners as well as the populace, and the police officers, sometimes the state, coldly, clinically, not out of vengeance, decides it's better for this person to be euthanized, to face the death penalty, capital punishment. Another one, convicted murderer, is a threat in and out of prison. And this is a guy in Illinois. He too, busting out, killing officers. The question is, isn't this a practical consideration? And isn't this why the Church has always been very careful the way it articulated this teaching?
Look, it's an awful thing to kill another human being. But occasionally it has to happen. Police have to do this. People in warfare have to do this. To me, and with all due respect for the Holy Father, I think that this is a rather sentimental approach to what he's calling human dignity. That in fact, it is one expression of respecting a person's human dignity to hold them responsible when they do a terrible thing.
Father Murray, doesn't the Pope have the right, though? He is the supreme lawgiver, the supreme pontiff. Doesn't he have the right to change teaching, to change the catechism?
He has a right to update the catechism, as John Paul II did in issuing a new catechism. The last one had been the Catechism of the Council of Trent. So the Pope can teach, but he can't change the previous teaching. The Pope is there to uphold the doctrine of the faith, not to rewrite it. And, you know, my point here of real contention with the Holy Father's action here is that this is not something that the Church had an opinion on. The Church taught that it was moral for the state as a public authority to carry out execution of certain criminals who were found guilty with certainty of certain crimes. Now, the whole question of punishment becomes under investigation here, let's say. If
I was going to ask
if it's an offense against human dignity to execute a criminal, is it an offense against human dignity for God to damn someone to hell? We say no, absolutely not. If someone is deserving of eternal punishment in hell, then that isn't according to the divine will, and that's a good thing. So lesser forms of punishment, including executions, life imprisonment, imprisonment for a period of time, these are all follow from the fact that punishment issued in a just way is good for both the criminal, for society, and for the authority that is holding justice. So there's a real problem here.
Cardinal Avery Dulles taught that this was actually a merciful act in some cases because you have very destructive people willing to kill others. They are now incarcerated, and if you let them have a life sentence, they sometimes continue that mindset, that action. But when you know my life is going to end 4 Wednesdays from now, it kind of clarifies the mind and the soul, and you might have a shot at redeeming that person or give them a shot at redemption that otherwise they might not have had the clarity on. I want to ask both of you this. This notion of the evolution of doctrine. In the introductory letter to this change in the Catechism, the Holy Office is saying the Pope sees an evolution of doctrine here. Is this an evolution or a break?
In my view, it's a break. Because the Pope has already been making statements about lifetime incarceration, that somehow this does not comport, as Father was just saying, with the idea that all human beings have a chance at redemption. He clearly doesn't like the idea that there can be even eternal punishment. We've had some strange remarks of his about hell in the past, perhaps. I find this to be to repeat myself, there's a kind of a sentimentality about this, as if there are certain things like people who are serial rapists, serial murderers, that the justice required in those circumstances can somehow be satisfied by simply protecting the community. I don't think that's true, and I think the entire tradition, there's some very good studies. There's a wonderful book by Joseph Bisset and Edward Feser about just came out in the last year about the death penalty that I think lays out as clearly as it possibly can be laid out what the tradition has been. And I think that they, in that book, have shown that this type of move on the part of a pope or anyone else is a change in what has been settled doctrine, not simply a development.
Wow. So, Father Murray, what does that mean? What does that mean for the faithful Catholic looking in on this? If this isn't a development of doctrine, do you think it's an evolution of doctrine? And what do you make of the notion that society has changed, so we now have to update and change the teaching? That seems to be the mind of the Holy Father. In fact, there's an interview I read with Father Spadaro from several years ago where he makes that argument.
Well, I agree with Bob. This is a break with the tradition. It's not a continuity. In fact, Cardinal Ladaria, in his introductory letter, accompanying letter to this change, claims that this is according to the canons of the Catholic Church, the Vincent of Lerins, that this is a development, not a change. You can't go from saying it is moral for the state to execute certain criminals to saying it is immoral for the state to execute certain criminals. You can't say that that's a development. That's an overthrow, and that's a change. Now, where this leads us, well, it's very worrying. We can't predict the future, but the death penalty has been a constant target of certain intellectuals in the Western world for a long time. Well, there are a lot of other targets they have. Catholic teaching on homosexuality, on artificial contraception, on the illegitimacy of certain Catholic moral teachings, you know, that certain sexual ethics teachings. Are all of those things going to be subject to an evolving societal understanding, you know, new understanding of human dignity? When the Pope says that the capital punishment offends human dignity, I just can't agree with him. As Bob said, if someone is on death row, the greatest dignity they need is to prepare themselves for eternal salvation. And by giving them a time frame and an access to a chaplain and the time to reflect, you're helping them. You know, human dignity also includes everybody else. What about the dignity of the people they murdered?
The victim, yeah.
You know, what is the reaction? Let's say Adolf Hitler had not killed himself in the Führer bunker and he were captured by the Allies. Would it be immoral to execute him? Well, according to this new Catholic teaching of the Pope, it would be. I disagree. We have to have this notion that society has to be defended and that the interests of society include recognizing the gravity of mass murder on a scale of the Nazis. You know, was Pol Pot, was he a subject of human dignity offended if he were executed? Of course not. Everybody recognizes that.
Now, this is a Pope, incidentally, we should make mention, as I heard from Father Jerry there a moment ago, the Pope also opposes indefinite incarceration of people, too. He doesn't like lifetime sentences. So where does this leave the Church in regard to criminal punishments?
Well, I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't even restrict it to that. I think that what we have here is another example of the sort of fudging of a difference between doctrine and a kind of a pastoral approach that is really, seems to lead doctrine into the opposite of what it has been in the past. And on this particular issue, it's relatively easy for the Pope to get some support, let's say, from in the nations of the West, where there are relatively few executions in America, Canada, Europe, anyway, as it is. In Europe, it's been illegal for quite a while in most countries. But what this does, I believe, is it sets up an expectation that sort of progressive views of what the Church should be teaching are really where the growing end of Catholicism is in our time in the 21st century. To change fundamentally an idea about life and death like this seems to me will have incalculable consequences as a result in all sorts of different areas, as Father was saying earlier. And why it was necessary to do this right now, we could speculate that there are many other things going on in the Church, and maybe this was a time to put this out there and maybe change the subject briefly for a while.
Change the narrative, yeah.
But I don't see the need for this. For me, where John Paul II went when he said that it was practically non-existent, the circumstances justifying
and all those popes, it should be said, Benedict, John Paul, they were advocating for the abolition of the death penalty as well, but they didn't change the Church teaching.
Exactly.
It's also hard to change it when the Papal States, not too long ago, were hanging people at the Tiber.
Right.
They had an official executor on staff. I mean, I do find that this is very confusing. We'll work it out in the days ahead. We have to move on to, sadly, more distressing news, even more distressing than what we've been talking about. The McCarrick scandal and this ongoing sex abuse scandal, it has caused anger, hurt feelings, and I think confusion among the laity like I have not seen in decades, really, since the last time this broke in 2002. It seems worse somehow this go round. Father Jerry, we keep hearing a lot of talk about Cardinal McCarrick almost exclusively as if he's the only predator in or has ever been in the Catholic Church. It's all about him. Is that too narrow a focus on the part of the bishops as well as some journalists?
I think that's what it's all about.
Well, I think the spectacle of a cardinal of the Catholic Church being revealed to be a child molester was just stunning. And what then came out subsequently, that three dioceses in New Jersey had paid off secretly 2 adults who were also abused by the ex-Cardinal McCarrick, and that those payoffs amounting to $180,000 were made on behalf of the sitting Archbishop of Washington at the time. Now, Cardinal Wuerl has said that the Archdiocese was never informed of those payouts. So basically what we have is behind-the-scenes secret machinations. There were confidentiality agreements demanded of the victims. All of this type of stuff was supposed to end after 2002, when the Boston scandal led to the Dallas Charter. We're not supposed to be protecting powerful people with the parishioners' money, paying off people and silencing them. That was shocking. Then more revelations come about other abuse victims of the cardinal, ex-cardinal now. I mean, we look like an institution that cannot manage its own house, even when we've been corrected. And remember, Cardinal McCarrick had done these things 50 years ago. He should have resigned. He should never have accepted being a bishop or a cardinal. Right. He went ahead and did all this in a reckless manner, which exposes the church now to this opprobrium, all to satisfy his lust, his power. You know, it's a horrible thing. He needs to do penance. It's not enough for him to resign from the cardinalate. He should tell the Pope he's sorry. He should resign from the priesthood. He should turn over every dime he has in the bank to the victims. He should repay those dioceses. I mean, his soul is important. I want him to go to heaven. But he has to display real repentance because this is horrible. This really is a terrible situation.
Bishop Olson of Fort Worth is calling for McCarrick's laicization. Is that something you would support? Do we need that?
Absolutely. I think that what we're seeing here now is the same rules that have been applied to priests need to be applied to bishops who either covered up abuse by those that were under their authority or themselves, as in the case of McCarrick, committed abuses. Now, I would say that laicization is important, that I think Father Jerry is right, that they have to actually pay reparations. I think that would be only just under the circumstances. But I would go even further. I think that like priests who have been caught doing what they shouldn't do, bishops, archbishops, cardinals who are convicted of who have been discovered to have committed what are crimes, abusing minors, for example, should also be referred to secular authorities. I think that Cardinal McCarrick, as old as he is, and as much as you don't want to punish an old man usually, I think in this particular case, just like anybody else who's alleged to have committed a crime, has to be referred to the secular authorities. Otherwise, it appears that we're not really serious. This is an internal church matter. He's no longer a priest, you know, etc. No,
this is the church's Me Too moment, or He Too moment, because a lot of the abused here were seminarians and young boys, at least in the McCarrick case. We'll talk about others. I want to read you, Father Jerry, this is Cardinal DiNardo, the president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference. He released a statement the other day in which he said that there were grave crimes committed here. And I'll read you the points. One, I encourage my brother bishops as they stand ready in our local dioceses to respond with compassion and justice to anyone who's been sexually abused or harassed by anyone in the church. We should do whatever we can to accompany them. Two, I would urge anyone who has experienced sexual assault or harassment by anyone in the church to come forward. Where the incident may rise to the level of a crime, please also contact local law enforcement. Third, the U.S. Bishops' Conference will pursue the many questions surrounding Archbishop McCarrick's conduct to the full extent of its authority. And finally, four, we bishops recognize that a spiritual conversion is needed as we seek to restore the right relationship among us and with the Lord. Our church is suffering from a crisis of sexual morality. The way forward must involve learning from past sins. Father GERALD Murray, is that sufficient? Does that hit the mark or miss it?
It's a good beginning, but now let's get down to practicalities. We need the equivalent of an independent prosecutor to be appointed to examine the diocesan files in every diocese in the United States to find out if payments have been made similar to the payments that the 3 dioceses in New Jersey made on behalf of Cardinal McCarrick. Are there any bishops currently occupying office who have abused adults or committed abuse of authority and got out of it because the people's money was handed to the victims along with the demand for confidentiality? We also need to know who was aware of these crimes and whether they did the right thing. I'd like to know if the Archbishop of Newark, John Myers, reported to Rome when he made that payout on behalf of Cardinal McCarrick. Did Rome know about it? Did Rome approve of that? I mean, this is a serious matter. If a pastor commits these crimes, he's off the job. If a bishop commits the crimes, people are paid off and told to be quiet. This is unjust. This is really, but it has to be independent in the sense it can't simply be appoint a bishop to look at his fellow bishops. That's not going to hold water in terms of the public perception.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in a moment, the solution for this. There were warnings There was that Dominican priest in Boston who wrote the letter to Cardinal O'Malley.
Benedict Ramsey.
Right, Father Ramsey, before,
Boniface Ramsey, I'm sorry.
right, before McCarrick was elevated to the Archdiocese of Washington. Why were those warnings not heeded? They're paying out settlements at the same time. There was a protocol in place. The bishops are talking about reforming protocols. We had a protocol in place in 2002. The protocol is refer the offense to the nuncio takes it to the Vatican. What happened here?
Yeah, well, that's what we don't know, and that's what we need to find out. And right now, there are several American cardinals whose authority and credibility has been compromised. Father talked about Cardinal Tobin in New York, in Newark, who should have known. If he didn't know, he should have known about it. Cardinal Wuerl here in Washington says he was never informed about these payouts. I'm rather disappointed in Cardinal O'Malley because he is the head, at least in theory, he's the head of that commission that the Holy Father has been trying to establish about abuse. And yet when that letter or in some other testimony went to his offices in Boston, we don't know if he personally saw it, but the person who was complaining was more or less told, well, this isn't our business. We're not going to do anything.
It doesn't affect Boston.
And Cardinal Farrell, who lived with Cardinal McCarrick here in Washington for 6 years, has claimed he doesn't know anything at all.
Let me, while you bring him up, I'm going to play a bite. Cardinal Farrell did another interview this week. Now, he was living with Cardinal McCarrick in the residence. He was the chancellor of the diocese. Here's what he said to the Associated Press. Watch.
At no time did any person ever from New Jersey or from New York ever speak to me about it. And no. And a matter of fact, I didn't hear a word about any of this. And then, that might be hard for somebody to believe, but if that's the only thing on your mind, well, then you'll focus on that. I was focused on running the Archdiocese, what Cardinal McCarrick was doing here, there, and everywhere, and all over the world. Didn't enter into my daily routine of running the Archdiocese of Washington.
Your reaction, Robert Royal?
I started to go through this list of cardinals, and Cardinal Farrell, look, we don't want a witch hunt. We want a honest investigation of what people knew and when it happened. But Cardinal Farrell, Cardinal Tobin, and others are going to be at this World Meeting on Families later this month. I'm going to be there myself. I wrote in the Catholic Thing this morning in a column that I think that this meeting should be canceled. I know this is a radical idea and it probably won't happen. But who now has credibility about family matters? Who in October, when the Vatican holds its synod on youth, who has credibility and is above suspicion? We need to clean house before we even address any of these other issues. And particularly here in America, it seems to be enough doubt about some of the very highest officials in the church that has to take precedence over everything else.
Father Jerry Murray, your reaction to what you heard from Cardinal Farrell?
Yes, well, it's very interesting. When the Newark Archdiocese, Metuchen, and Trenton entered into these confidentiality agreements with payouts, they had to have been in touch with Cardinal McCarrick at the time. Cardinal McCarrick needs to answer the question, was there any written correspondence in this matter? Do you retain that in your own possession? Did you destroy it? Why is it that no one who worked for you was aware of these two payouts? Was no one involved in your correspondence or your matters? Did you have a lawyer that worked for you as evaluating these claims? In other words, there's a lot of stuff that happens when you pay out $180,000 to 2 adult victims of sexual abuse by an American cardinal. None of that is found. Nobody knows. I mean, it's very, very troubling because it shows that the secrecy and the power and the wealth of the Catholic Church were being used to basically keep an immoral man in a position of power.
Yep.
Having done these things, he should have resigned in shame. He should not have stayed in power. And yet, after he left the Archbishop of Washington, he continued traveling the world as a representative of the Church. Very troubling. Lots of questions need to be answered.
Well, look, one of the dangers, I think, for all of us, even for those of you watching, is to isolate this and make this all about one man's misdeeds, Theodore McCarrick's misdeeds. This, from my vantage point, and I hate to be here, I hate to even bring this up, but when you look at Austria, where a cardinal resigned because he was having sexual activity with men. You have Chile, where another guy had to resign. Same deal. Honduras, abusing seminarians. You've got a male prostitute in Italy naming 60 priests in Italian papers. This is not isolated to, a DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. This is a global problem, and it seems to me a global answer is required. What should that answer be? Some are saying we should have, as Father Murray did, an independent council. But I just want to tell everybody, I want to remind you, I spoke to members of the National Review Board that were appointed last time. They were infinitely frustrated because they did not have discovery or enforcement powers. They are lay people. And the bishop said, no, you can go this far. You can ask each diocese to do an audit, but all that meant was they would show you the files they wanted to show. That didn't get anywhere. How do we move forward now? Robert Royal.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. How could you impanel an organization that would really have some discovery powers? I'm going to just say this. I don't know if this will happen or not, but I don't think this time around you can stop the investigations. I think that there are going to be criminal investigations, or as is happening in Chile, and this goes all the way to the C9, the 9 cardinals who advised the Holy Father. Cardinal Errázuriz from Chile has been investigated by the local authorities, and I'm quite sure he's going to have to resign for his own cover-ups. His successor, Cardinal Ezzuti, is an Italian who got Chilean citizenship as he was rising in the hierarchical ranks down there. And a commission this week, I believe, or next week in Chile is about to strip him of his Chilean citizenship. So, look, we could maybe in the United States gather together an independent board that will begin to investigate these things, because I don't think that the USCCB is going to be able to keep a lid on this.
No.
I think that the secular journalists are going to start to look into this. Whether we can trace it all the way into the Vatican, why was there not information at the Vatican itself about Cardinal McCarrick? How could there possibly not be transmission? Now, it may be that there wasn't, but if there wasn't, that in itself is a problem, and we need to know why that happened.
I hate to say this, the man raised hundreds of millions of dollars. He had power in the Vatican. And Father Murray, I want you to react to this. I'm going to take my Mother Angelica moment here. I'm not going to assume that this is anything she would say, but inspired by her, I will say, looking at this, thinking about it, praying about it, talking to a lot of people this week, a lay panel alone is not going to do the job. And the bishops can't police themselves. They've had 20 years to do that. They've failed. My sense is, if you look at Honduras, if you look at Chile, if you look at Australia, when Cardinal Pell did a forensic financial audit, he discovered all this sexual misconduct attached to the money. As a Cardinal told me this week, who shall remain nameless, if you find the honey pots, you'll find the honeys. I think he's right. We need to empanel an independent lay forensic financial audit that is made public to the laity. Then the laity can hold the clergy responsible. Last time, Father Murray, we carved out the bishops. We carved them out of the equation, made them immune from prosecution within the church. This time it seems we're carving the priests out and focusing only on the bishops and the cardinals. We have to take everybody into account this time, or we're going to relive this thing in another 20 years. Your reaction, Father Murray?
Well, there's a lot there, Raymond. Let me say I agree with you that this has to be lay people who have the capabilities and powers to investigate all these different aspects of the problem. Now, Rome, though, is responsible for the supervision of the bishops. The Holy Father is responsible, and he has taken that task seriously as regards Chile. What I would tell the Holy Father as my advice in this matter, he should appoint a tribunal, meaning a judge or a panel of judges as a special tribunal for the United States with full authority to look at every document in every chancery and every religious congregation house regarding sexual abuse and financial irregularities associated with it. The bishop should be compelled by this authority to answer the questions of hired experts. In other words, the tribunal should basically put the work of investigating and coming up with information in the hands of competent people. That means private investigators, lawyers, all the rest. They can compile the documentation, and then the judges should have the power to make decisions. This should all be made public in the sense that their findings should not be kept in a closet, and then the Pope will decide, well, maybe, maybe not. No. If someone is found guilty of using church money to cover up the sexual crimes of bishops or clergymen, they should be out. You know, why should the federal government and private organizations like corporations have higher ethical standards regarding its leadership than us?
Yeah.
You know, can you imagine IBM ever transferring a guy who was committing sexual crimes in one diocese to the other, and when it was found out, leaving him in place? Wouldn't happen. We have been lax. This is a problem.
Robert Royal, your reaction?
Yeah, I'm going to say again, I hope that that is what happens, because I think that the only way it would happen is if the secular interest in this becomes strong enough that the church can no longer try to hide itself, and there's no way that the bishops in the United States are going to investigate themselves.
Nope.
We've seen that in the past. It's not going to happen. But I want to go back and say, I wrote this in a column today, I think the church at some point is going to have to do public penitence for this. If it were up to me, instead of having a world meeting on families in Ireland, I would have a public procession of penitence for sexual sins committed against minors and against seminarians and others around the world. The church is in a crisis at this moment, and it's going to get worse. I mean, it's sad to say this, but it's going to get worse because it's the Me Too moment, or the He Too moment.
The He Too moment is
in
here.
the church, and it's going to involve some very, very serious pain and some soul searching, but there is no alternative. The alternative is business as usual, and business as usual is going to lead to bankruptcy.
Almost 20 years ago, our friend Father Richard John Newhouse sat where you're sitting and said, the answer here is fidelity, fidelity, fidelity. I will add again, it's now accountability, accountability, accountability. And we must find an instrument to make that happen. My sense is what Father Jerry proposed is the right path. I think you also have to have a forensic financial audit. And I did not like, and many did not like, that the Vatican shut down the Price Waterhouse audit that was about to uncover a lot in Rome, and they trembled and shut it down, and shut Cardinal Pell down too. I'm not going to get into all of that. Father Jerry, last word.
Well, you know, the good people of the church and then the rest of America who's following this story need to know that most priests, most religious, most sisters have nothing to do with these crimes. They are horrified by it. The Catholic Church in the United States is not made up of a cabal of criminals. They're a small group of people doing it. They have a lot of power, unfortunately. But we need to support our good priests and nuns and brothers by praying for them. But this is a moment, you know, a crucial moment in the sense that we can no longer say, after 2002, the bishops said they're going to clean up the mess. Well, they didn't. So now the bishops have to say, this mess is going to be cleaned up by someone else, and we're going to cooperate with them. That's what they have to say.
Very good. We will leave it there. Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, thank you so much. To keep up with Bob and Father Jerry, their insight and commentary can be found at thecatholicthing.org. Bill Donahue is up next, but first, I want to get to an important newsmaker for some perspective on the way forward out of this sex abuse crisis. I want to go to the former chairman of the USCCB's first National Review Board, Governor Frank Keating. He joins us via phone from Oklahoma. Governor, thank you for your time. Governor Keating, you were the first head of the National Review Board. It did not turn out so well. You resigned. You were kind of forced to resign by Cardinal Mahoney at the time for comments you made equating the bishops to the mafia. It seems you were almost prescient now.
Well, you know, I guess I have too much Protestant blood. I'm kidding when I say my four grandparents, Quaker, Methodist, Presbyterian, Catholic. My wife and I were not married in the Catholic Church, though she later became a Catholic. But when the bishops asked me to chair this board, I said to Bishop Gregory, if we do this right, I'll never be a Knight of Malta and you'll never be a Cardinal. Well, we had a good laugh, but there really was a lot of truth to the fact that initially the attitude of some bishops was, well, we created this so that you could say that you're doing things and that's all good, but realize who really runs this place. My view was that's true, but the bishops said to us they wanted, 1, transparency, 2, criminal referral of violators, and 3, zero tolerance, which meant if they settled a sex abuse case, then that needed to be in the public record and the public domain. If an individual, no matter if the person was a prelate or a brand new priest, if that individual misbehaved and raped and sodomized a young man, that should be referred to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. This isn't canon law stuff. And we will not tolerate this in the future, and all of this will be public. So they did it right on paper. I ran it the way I felt they wanted, but apparently some prelates were not very happy with that.
Now, when you look at what's happening today, at the scope of the sex abuse crisis really throughout the church, I offered earlier the suggestion that we have a forensic audit, a financial one, across the church, just to see the financial corruption that might lead to the sexual misconduct and corruption. Your thoughts on that? What is the solution here? What should be taking place?
Well, I had the head of the Southern Baptist Convention when I was chairman call me, the Pope of the Southern Baptists, and he said, Frank, you guys need to fix this because you're the mother church, and if you crash and burn, we all crash and burn. So I think to have a forensic audit, to re-examine a lot of these cases, and to find out, did in fact our board receive information about prelates or senior clergymen, but it never got to the board, never got to us, then that is an absolutely atrocious, completely unacceptable result. And I would hope the Conference of Catholic Bishops would find the best, brightest. Is there somewhere in the group, St. Augustine, a Cardinal Newman, who would step to the fore and say, this is not my faith, this is not Jesus' church, we will not tolerate this no matter what the rank of the offender.
Governor Keating, it's clear the bishops are unable to police themselves. There has to be a lay role in the solution here. What should it be? The National Review Board didn't seem to find that balance because the bishops were unwilling to give you all the tools and the authority, frankly, to follow through on the mandate. How would you suggest doing things differently, and how might the laity be involved and faithful at the same time?
By the way, we're very supportive, but there were a number of bishops that felt this is not a layman's duty. This is our duty. If we have criminality and corruption and impropriety, we need to clean it up ourselves. Obviously, that didn't happen. I never had heard of the McCarrick misbehavior, and yet apparently it was floating around in a number of circles about that time that we created the board in 2002. But the charter of the board, the lay board, was solid. What was needed is to make sure that at the highest levels of the church, the archbishops and the cardinals were fully supportive. But my initial reaction as chairman of the board was some of the highest ranked people in the church were not real happy, but I assumed it was because they were afraid of embarrassment or they couldn't pay the mortgage off if, in fact, not all of this stuff became public. But now I'm, more suspicious, and I think the Catholic Review Board needs to be reconstituted with people that are not working for the church as head of Catholic Charities or some other wholly owned subsidiary of the diocese, but tough, no-nonsense, former military people, significant citizens. Even though on our board we had Bob Bennett, the super lawyer, Leon Panetta, who later became Secretary of Defense, but we didn't get the information that would suggest to us that the rot was as deep as it was and as high as it was.
Governor Keating, I thank you for the time, and hopefully you can join us another time.
Thank you so much.